All right, welcome to the 8th biology class of the summer session. I'm Karen, and then we have Daniel here too. We're going to be going over a lot of bodily systems today, the endocrine system, the cardiovascular system, the blood system, the lymphatic system, the cardiovascular system. Lots of stuff today. Or sorry, the immune system. There you go. Lots of stuff today. So if you don't know already, we're Prima Peers. We're a nonprofit based in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We're always here to help. Feel free to contact us through Slack or email. Our email is right here, info@premedpeers.org. If you have any questions about, for example, getting on the newsletter, anything about the course, anything about this class, anything about homework, just message us. And yeah, so next slide. And this is the session outline, so I'm gonna see if you guys have any questions on the homework. As usual, this is all the homework that you should have looked at. And we're gonna do some warm-up questions, and then we're gonna do content review with some slides, and then we're gonna have a practice passage. Next slide. And this is most of what we're covering. We ended up adding a little more detail to our slides, but this is the general gist of what we're going to be going over today. Next slide. And so now it's time for the homework review. Did anybody have any questions on anything from Khan Academy or mcatreview.org? Any content that you might not understand quite yet? Or any questions on the practice questions? If not, we'll just move on to content review. Or sorry, word question. My bad. So we got 4 for you today. Feel free to put your answers in the chat or speak out loud if you have any reasoning. The first question here is for the endocrine system. So which of the following statements is false? Be sure to read carefully. Do we have any guesses for this question? Any educated guesses?
I guess maybe do you just want to go over it? Maybe they're a little uncertain because it's a little complicated.
For sure. So, all right, next slide. So the answer to this question is actually A. So this is kind of a tricky question because going over the incorrect answer. So it's true that aldosterone is created in the adrenal cortex. So there's a distinction between the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. It is going over that during the content review. Follicle stimulating hormone, we usually see that as FSH in an acronym. It is created in the anterior pituitary gland. That's part of the flat peg. It's the acronym flat peg. And yes, glucagon is created in the pancreas along with insulin. With oxytocin, this is a very common mistake people might think. So oxytocin is actually created in the hypothalamus, and it's sent to posterior pituitary gland, but posterior pituitary gland is responsible for actually releasing it to the rest of the body. So that's kind of the distinction there. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions on that one? warm-up question number 2. This is concerning electrical conduction in the heart. So which of the following accurately shows the electrical pathway through the heart? So we have the 4 different areas of the heart through which the electrical pathway runs, and your job is to choose the right order. So feel free to put your answer in the chat or say it out loud. We got an answer. Hannah said D, and next slide. You are correct. Great job, Hannah. So just to review, so the SA node starts kind of above the, I believe it's the right ventricle, kind of near the right ventricle. So SA stands for sinoatrial. So the sinoatrial node kind of goes down to the atrioventricular node. So it's in between, you would imagine, the atrium and the ventricles, the atria and the ventricles. And then it goes down to the bundle of His, and then it spreads out through the Purkinje fibers to the rest of the heart. So great job, Hannah.
Yeah, how I remember this one is there's an acronym, STAB, a big pickle. So that's how I think of it. SA node, STAB, A, big pickle. You know.
That's really funny. That's a good acronym. Okay. So here's our third question. It has to do with the lymphatic system. So what wouldn't you expect to find in the lymph fluid? So this time we have 5 choices. Try not to get too overwhelmed, but one should stick out to you pretty quickly. I'll give you a couple more seconds to guess. All right, next slide. So the answer to this question is C, red blood cells. So you would typically expect to see white blood cells in the lymph fluid because a lot of immune system stuff happens in the lymphatic system. And then you could also find proteins and water and triglycerides. Proteins and water is also found in plasma, which is able to become part of the lymph fluid, and triglycerides, you'd be able to find that as well. Red blood cells, they typically don't leak out of veins and capillaries unless, they rupture. So in normal circumstances, they don't usually enter the lymphatic system, usually just white blood cells. And here's our last question. Any guesses on this question? No idea, no worries, we'll be going over it. So, so the function of the thymus, um, for the most part, with regards to the immune system, is the place where T cells go to mature. So that's the function of the thymus with regards to the immune system. So A is wrong because hypothyroidism has to do with the thyroid, not the thymus, so it's not really related. T cells aren't generated in the thymus, they're generated in the bone marrow along with B cells. And B cells also mature in the bone marrow, so the B cells aren't related to the thymus. And T3 and T4, those are thyroid hormones, so that also makes it unrelated to the thymus. So the correct answer is B. And that concludes our warm-up questions. So we're going to have our content review starting with the endocrine system. So before I go into like the specific hormones, I'm going to go over kind of the categories and types that you should be aware of. So in general, the function of the endocrine system is to make hormones, and hormones allow for a specified control of target cells for whatever that hormone can control. So it can be at the cellular level, or the tissue level, or even the organ level. So some different types of hormones. So there's endocrine hormones. They travel mainly in the blood. Exocrine hormones, they travel mainly through ducts. So you can see here the hormones kind of leaving the, so you have like the hormones like using ducts to kind of leave the body through sweat. And you also have autocrine hormones, which hormones kind of act on the cell that it comes from, so it acts on itself, on its own cell. And paracrine hormones, it kind of acts on the neighboring cells, so the hormone sent to like the neighboring cells. So that's that. There's also different types of hormones based on kind of what they're made of. So there's peptide-based hormones, so they're made of like amino acids or like protein polypeptides. An example of that would be on over here. Over here we have oxytocin, I believe. We also have steroid-based hormones. If you don't know if it's steroid based or not. You usually just look for the end of the end of the word. If it ends with ONE, it's usually a steroid based hormone. So like progesterone or aldosterone or testosterone. Usually, a lot of those are steroid based. And then there's also tyrosine derivative hormone. So tyrosine is a specific amino acid, and tyrosine tends to um, the things that are derived from tyrosine, they tend to, I believe it's like things like epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that's kind of a distinction there. There's also a difference between water-based hormones and lipid-based hormones. So lipid-based hormones, steroid-based hormones fall under the lipid class, while peptides and amino acid-based hormones fall under the water class. And they function differently in terms of how they communicate with the cell. So water-based hormones, they function through a secondary messenger system. So on this left side here, you have a peptide hormone. It binds to a receptor at the edge of the cell. And from there, it triggers a signal transduction cascade. And from there, particles, proteins, and things that are part of the cascade end up communicating with the nucleus. So you would call water-based hormones secondary messengers. As opposed to lipid-based hormones, they have the ability to cross the cell membrane without any like hitch. So they don't need a receptor to bind to because they can enter the cell on its own. And they can travel directly to the nucleus to trigger a cellular response. So we would call that the primary messenger system. Next, we're going to go over the hormones found in the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. So I found this really neat diagram to kind of help you see where things start and then what's connected to what and where everything's going. So the general schematic of kind of the endocrine system is you start at a gland, the gland, or you start at a gland, the gland secretes the hormone, and the hormone targets an organ, usually in the body. So you starting in the hypothalamus. We have all of these hormones secreted in the hypothalamus. So we have GnRH, which is gonadotropic releasing hormone. And then we have CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone. We have TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone. We have PRH, which is prolactin releasing hormone, which works antagonistically with dopamine. So another way to refer to dopamine is prolactin inhibiting factor. So they both work. They both work antagonistically to affect the release of prolactin to trigger kind of the creation of milk in the mammary glands, or like the boobs. And so there's that. So PRH helps to stimulate prolactin, while dopamine helps to inhibit the production of prolactin. So that's an important distinction to make. And here we have GHRH, which is growth hormone releasing hormone. I know it's kind of confusing compared to GnRH, so just kind of say it out loud whenever you see it, and it'll help you remember. And we also have somatostatin here. But the main thing I want to focus on is GHRH. And GHRH makes growth hormone, and that affects the liver and it affects the growth of things, so in general. So going back to GnRH, so GnRH, gonadotropic releasing hormone, goes to the anterior pituitary gland, stimulates the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which targets the gonads. FSH and LH should be really familiar to you while you're studying the reproductive system. It's very important in kind of the process of ovulation. These hormones are very important in triggering things like estrogen and progesterone, just to kind of jog your memory. Corticotropin releasing hormone goes into your pituitary gland, which releases, I believe it's adrenocorticotropic hormone, something like that. And it goes through adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol. Thyroid releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary gland, which releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid. And so that's everything having to do with the anterior pituitary gland. A acronym that you should know with the anterior pituitary gland, I know it's a lot. I'm getting like a tongue twist. Is flat peg. So you have FSH for F, LH for L, ACTH for A, TSH for T. So that's flat. And then prolactin for P. Endorphins should be here. So endorphins are also released from the anterior pituitary. So that's E. And then growth hormone for G. So that's flat peg. So that's probably the best acronym to remember it with, unless Daniel, you've learned something totally different.
No, yeah, that's probably one of the most high yield acronyms to memorize.
Yeah, so it's super important. And then next so the hypothalamus, so going back, wait, I have to talk about the posterior pituitary. So here we have the posterior pituitary gland and its relationship to the hypothalamus. So going back to the warm-up question that we had, so we have ADH and oxytocin. ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone. So these are both created in the hypothalamus and they're released from the posterior pituitary. The ADH goes to the kidney, and it controls water retention, and oxytocin goes to the mammary glands and kind of stimulates kind of like feelings of attachment and also feelings of and other feelings as well. So that's the difference between anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. All right, next slide. And we have a bunch of other glands that I'd like to mention. As an aside, I'm only going to go over some of the glands in this picture, but I ended up learning all of these for the MCAT, pretty much all of them. So whatever I don't mention, you'll probably learn in another section of the bodily system. So we have the pineal gland, which releases melatonin. Melatonin makes you sleepy. The thyroid releases T3 and T4. They have a lot of functions, T3 and T4. And then calcitonin, its main thing is to control calcium levels. So it lowers calcium levels in, is it the blood or the bone? I think it's in the blood. So yeah, so the way it lowers calcium, that's how I think of it. And the way I like to think of it, or like the way I like to remember it is that it tones calcium down, so the calcitonin. There's that. And then the parathyroid gland, this is really easy. It releases parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Parathyroid hormone increases the level of calcium, generally. The pancreas has insulin and glucagon. It also has somatostatin, which you'll learn more in the kind of the digestive system. The adrenal cortex, it releases things like cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens. Here you also have distinctions between like glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, and aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid. The adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline or noradrenaline. Ovary releases estrogen and progesterone, and the testes releases testosterone. And you can also look up the other hormones that you see here if you're curious. And before and to wrap up the endocrine system, I just wanted to go over this really important concept called feedback loops. So we have two forms of feedback. We have negative feedback and positive feedback. The thing that you'll see the most is negative feedback. So that's when you have kind of the process of, we have the hypothalamus stimulating the pituitary gland to stimulate the release of hormones. And in negative feedback, the hormone release stimulates the reduction of its own release. So it would go back to the anterior pituitary gland and say like, hey, we have enough hormone already. Stop making more hormones. And they'll be like, okay, and they'll stop. So that's negative feedback. And positive feedback is kind of the opposite. So you have the hormone going back to the AP, for example, and saying, "Hey, we need more hormones. Can you make some more?" And they'll make more. So the hormone induces its own release of more hormones. So that's negative versus positive. And we have an example here with thyroxine, also known as T4. One of the many functions of T4 is to manage kind of your homeostasis and thermoregulation. So for example, so that's why it starts here with cold exposure. So when you're cold and you need to get warmer, the, the hypothalamus is stimulated, releases thyrotropin releasing hormone, goes into your pituitary, releases thyrotropin, which goes to the thyroid, which releases thyroxine. And it's thyroxine that ends up going, that when there's enough thyroxine released and the body is warm enough again, it goes back to stimulate the anterior pituitary to say, we're done. We don't need to be warmer anymore, and it stops. So in this case, thyroxine and has a negative feedback loop with its hormone production. So moving on, we have the cardiovascular system. So I wanted to go over, so here's a general picture of the cardiovascular system. I know it's very, very long reaching and wide, and it looks really cool, honestly. The functions of the cardiovascular/circulatory system, in general, have the delivery of O2. So you're able to transport oxygen throughout the blood. The release of CO2 so that we can exhale it. The absorption of nutrients, so nutrients travel through the blood. Waste, they also travel through the blood to be excreted. Hormones, they also travel through the blood to get to other glands. And then another thing is thermoregulation, which we'll go over, all of which we'll go over in a little more detail. So here's the anatomy of the heart. I'll just walk you through it. So we have 4 chambers. So if you're kind of confused by the left versus right, just imagine that you're looking at a patient, and this is from the patient's point of view. So this is the left atrium here, even though it's on the right side, and here's the right atrium here, even though it's on the left side technically, but this is from the perspective of the patient. So you have the left atrium and the right atrium, and the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Those are the 4 chambers of the heart. I also want to point out the 4 valves of the heart. So in between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have the mitral valve. Mi stands for 2 in this case. So it has like kind of two flaps, even though it doesn't show it here. In between the right atrium and the right ventricle, we have the tricuspid valve, which has 3 flaps. And I usually remember that the tricuspid valve is part of the right side of the heart because like you have the R here. So the tri is on the right side. So there's that one. The right ventricle leads to the pulmonary artery, but it goes through the pulmonary valve. So from the right ventricle, you have the pulmonary valve, and it goes to the pulmonary artery. And then lastly, we have the left ventricle, which connects to the aorta through the aortic valve. And then we also have the general veins and arteries here. We have the aorta, which leads to the rest of the arteries in the body. And then we have the inferior vena cava, which is where all the veins from the lower half of your body go to, and then the veins on the upper half of your body flow through the superior vena cava, and they both filter into the right atrium. So those are the kind of basic arteries and valves, the major arteries and valves that are connected to the heart. And I also wanted to point out that there's 3 layers of the heart wall. We have the endocardium on this right side. This is the innermost side. We have the myocardium. So myocardial infarction is when the heart muscle dies. So this is what they're referring to. The myocardium is dying and it's not able to contract the ventricles. And we also have the pericardium on the side. So that's something that I learned that's fun to know. And next we have this flow, the circulatory flow. So I have a list of kind of the cycle that it goes through. Typically, we start at the right side because we to go to the lungs first, so it can be oxygenated. So we start at the right atrium up here, and we go through the tricuspid valve down to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, we go to the pulmonary valve, to the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery is deoxygenated. So remember that. Pulmonary artery goes, but it's called the artery because it goes away from the heart. So the pulmonary artery goes to the lungs, and the lungs is where blood gets oxygenated. From there, it goes to the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein is oxygenated, but it's carrying blood towards the heart, so that's why it's called the vein. And from the pulmonary veins go to the left atrium. The left atrium goes through the mitral valve to the left ventricle, and from there the left ventricle goes through the aortic valve to the aorta. And here you have the aorta traveling through different arteries, and so they have like kind of this this little circuit system where it lists the different kinds of blood vessels. So it goes to the arteries, and then arterioles, capillaries, and then venules, and then the veins. And then from the veins, they dump into the vena cava. So we mentioned that in the last slide, and both of those dump into the right atrium, and so the cycle begins all over again. And here's a slide on blood pressure. So definition of blood pressure is the pressure blood exerts on the walls of the blood vessel. And something that you should know is the distinction between diastolic pressure and systolic pressure. So diastolic pressure is the blood pressure measured when blood is not being pumped, aka when the ventricles are relaxing. And systolic pressure is the blood pressure when the blood is being pumped, aka when the ventricles are contracting. So the ventricle contracting means that like the blood is being sent to, so the right ventricle sends blood to the lungs, and the left ventricle sends blood to the rest of the body. So when they're contracting, it's stimulating blood flow to the rest outside of the heart. Systolic pressure tends to be high, is always higher than diastolic pressure. I believe the normal value is, I think, like 120 over 80, or is it 120 over 90? One of those. So that's blood pressure. And can you go back to the previous slide, actually? So, and so this top half here, I also wanted to point out, so this top half here, so where blood flow goes to and from the lungs, that's pulmonary circulation. And the bottom half of this list here, where blood flows back and forth to the body and back, is systemic circulation. So I wanted to make that distinction as well. And sorry. Oh, wait, sorry. And if you can note here, kind of where it says high pressure, lowest pressure, highest pressure. So the highest pressure tends to be in the arteries, and the lowest pressure tends to be, the highest pressure tends to be in the arteries as it's coming out of the heart, and the lowest pressure tends to be in the veins as it's coming back to the heart. So there's kind of a differential of pressure as it goes throughout the system. Next, we're going to go over heart sounds. This is probably one of the hardest things for me to learn because it's just like, it's so hard to visualize, but I'll try to do my best here. So we have lub dub. So starting, we have lub and dub. So lub is the first sound that you hear. It's also known as S1. And lub is, and you have this is taken straight from Khan Academy, by the way. So this slide right here. So with lub and dub, you should kind of be able to visualize what valves are opening and what valves are shutting. And the sound that you hear with lub dub is the sounds of the valves closing. So which valves are closing? So in lub, the valves that are closing are the tricuspid and the mitral valves. And in that case, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valves are opening. So the reason why you can hear lub more than dub is because that's when the ventricles are like pushing the blood out. That's kind of what I have in my head. That's when the blood is rushing out of the heart to the rest of the body, and that requires a pretty strong force. So that's lub. And dub is the opposite. So dub is when the pulmonary artery and the the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve snap shut, and so they close, and that allows for blood to fill into the heart. So the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve open. So in lub, you're hearing the tricuspid and the mitral valves closing, and in dub, you're hearing the pulmonary valve and the aortic valves closing. So S1 and S2. And in this top right corner of this picture, you have so when you have like I was saying before, so when you have S1, when you have lub, and you have the blood you have the blood flowing to the overall system of the body. That's when systole occurs, and that's when that's when you can have that's when you can measure systolic pressure. And when S2 closes, and when you hear S2, so you have the dub, and you have, when that occurs, that's when diastole occurs. So that's when the heart's filling up. And so I have in this bottom right corner, kind of, it's pointing at which valves are opening, it's pointing at the valves that are closing. So the arrows here refer to the green text here. Does anyone have any questions on this? I know it's kind of tough. All right. And then here's another warm question. So we have the cardiac action potential, the conduction of the action potential through the heart. So we have our four main areas that we should know. So we have the SA node up here, and then the AV node here. So the SA travels to, so the electrical conduction travels from the SA node to the AV node, and then it goes down to it splits off into the left bundle branch. Oh, so we have the bundle of his here, right in the middle of the heart, and then it splits off into the left bundle branch. So remember, we're looking patient point of view, left bundle branch and the right bundle branch, and both of those split into Purkinje fibers. So that's the conduction of the heart. And the internodal pathway and Bachman's bundle, I didn't really see as much, so don't worry about that. And we have blood vessels. So this is a slide on the arteries, the capillaries, and the veins. So starting in this top right corner, we have the kind of progression of arteries becoming arterioles, arterioles becoming capillaries. So that capillaries are the thinnest vessel in the thinnest blood vessel. And it's only made of one single layer of endothelium, if you see on the other diagram. And then from there, capillaries become venules. They branch into venules, which branch into veins. So artery, arteriole, capillaries, venules, veins. That's the direction of flow that you should know. And in this left side is kind of a diagram kind of pointing out the anatomy of the veins. So arteries tend to have a higher pressure than veins. And you can see why here, because you see the arteries have a lot more muscle than the veins. So with a smaller diameter for blood to flow through, that ends up creating a high resistance, which translates to higher blood pressure. So just remember, arteries kind of have more muscle than the veins. And the arteries, the elastic arteries tend to be more elastic than muscular arteries. So you have here, so there's a distinction between the elastic artery and the muscular artery. Elastic arteries tend to have a lot more elastin. So I know that sounds kind of like a cop out, but elastin is a protein. So elastin makes things elastic. And then muscular arteries tend to have a lot more muscle. And then we have arterioles here, which is mainly 2 layers with the endothelium and the tunica externa. Arterioles are the most important site for vasoconstriction. So kind of think about that. Kind of associate these two with each other while you're studying. And so going to this section here, the bottom right corner, we have the difference between vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So vasodilation is when the blood vessel dilates or the diameter becomes bigger. So when the diameter becomes bigger, it allows for more heat to travel through the vessel, and it allows for heat loss. So when you're sweating, and there's a lot of heat leaving your body, that's when vasodilation occurs. And vasoconstriction occurs when you're trying to conserve heat. So you see the blood vessels becoming narrower or getting a smaller diameter. So that happens when you want to stay warm instead of stay cool. So yeah, I think that's all I have for the cardiovascular system. And then I'll be talking about the hematologic system, and then Daniel will be covering the rest. So the composition of blood, in this right side over here, the most simply you can put it is plasma. You have one part that's plasma, and then one part that's platelets and white blood cells, and the other part's red blood cells. So the red is obviously red. The yellow is plasma. That contains a lot of things. It's over 90, at least 90% water, and it also contains ions, proteins, and nutrients, and waste and gases. So a lot of the functions that I mentioned at the beginning for the circulatory system travels through the plasma. And we have the platelets, which is responsible for coagulation, white blood cells, which is really responsible for fighting off pathogens, and they lead the immune system. And red blood cells, they contain hemoglobin, which is a blood protein, transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. And important thing to note, they have no nucleus and no organelles. That will just I've always had questions where it just sneaks up on me where they're like, ha, you forgot that red blood cells have no nucleus. And I'm like, oh man. So there's that. And then there's also the distinction between hemoglobin and hematocrit. In medical terminology, this is referred to as H&H. So hematocrit, so the definition of that is the percent volume of red blood cells found in the blood. And that tends to be around 45%. And lastly, I have these 3 diagrams to kind of show you how gas transport works with oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as the infamous O2 curve. I'm sorry if you're scared. So starting from the left side, we have O2. Oxygen binds to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has 4 spots that can carry oxygen. So it has 4 it can carry 4 units of oxygen at a time. So that's what a full hemoglobin protein looks like with oxygen. And so it says here 2% dissolves into plasma and 98% combines with hemoglobin, but just kind of assume that that all oxygen kind of combines with hemoglobin. And hemoglobin can also release oxygen at certain points. So you have this the O2 curve with affinity, and when oxygen is most likely to um, be bound to hemoglobin, and when it's more likely to be released. But we'll talk more about that in a second. So we also have carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide also has the ability to bind to hemoglobin. And a lot of this has to do with kind of the bicarbonate equation. So just to review, that's when CO2 and H2O, they combine to make bicarbonate. And from there, it makes HCO3 minus and H plus. So you have that equation, so where one element can go up and other elements can go down as a result. So in certain conditions, sorry. So carbon dioxide, the way that it binds to hemoglobin is through going through this process when it becomes bicarbonate. And it binds to hemoglobin in kind of that form. So next we have the oxygen curve. So the normal curve is the red curve here, and we experience left shift, which means that you have the P50 line right here. So this is when this is the probability that 50% of hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. So starting in this red curve, you have kind of this, you have the level of O2 for P50. The left shift signifies that less O2 is So a left shift occurs when there's a higher affinity for O2. So you have less oxygen unloading from hemoglobin. So you're more likely to have oxygen bound to hemoglobin. And it occurs in these conditions. And a right shift leads to a right shift occurs when more oxygen is being unloaded. And so there's a lower O2 affinity, and it occurs in these conditions. So conditions here is when the partial pressure of oxygen goes down, when acidity goes down, and therefore pH goes up, when the temperature is lowered, when phosphate is lowered, and other factors like that. And on the other side, so what makes O2 affinity decrease is when there's a partial pressure of carbon dioxide increasing. So when more carbon dioxide is binding to hemoglobin, when there's an increased acidity and therefore a lower pH, a higher temperature, and more DPG. That's kind of a factor that plays into this. So that's kind of a general overview. I could go into a lot more detail, but that's pretty much the general gist of things.
So next I'll be talking about the lymphatic system. So basically its functions are to collect interstitial fluid. That's basically the main function. So you can imagine that sometimes there's going to be blood vessels that leak out a little bit. Maybe there's a burst vessel, or there's just always going to be fluid in between your organs, outside of cells. So basically the function of the lymphatic system is to collect all of that liquid, kind of refine it, make sure there's no bacteria in there, and then just send it back out. So another function of this is to transport large proteins or fat. So basically, in your intestines, when you're absorbing nutrients, small things like carbohydrates, they can just go right through the lining of the tissue. But if you have large fats, they're not going to be able to go right into those tiny blood vessels. So what basically happens is that those large fats, they kind of get active transported into the lymphatic system. And basically it kind of takes a detour pathway and then it goes all the way to the vena cava, which is a very large vessel. So there it's able to fit in and kind of slip in that way. And then additionally, it also produces lymphocytes. So as we'll talk about the immune system, they kind of basically work hand in hand. And then what is lymph? Lymph is it's basically water, like a lot of fluids in the body, but kind of the cellular components of it would be white blood cells. That would be the main component of it. And then also the proteins and fats that are being transported. And these are transported by chylomicrons. So they're basically, you can think of like a cell with its lipid membrane, except for there's only one layer of phospholipids. So the inside is very water-fearing. It's very oily, but the outside likes water. So basically, this is the way, because if that wasn't the case, these fats wouldn't want to go anywhere near the lymph, which is water. So basically, it's kind of like a little circle, and all of the fats are inside it, and that's how they kind of just transport through the lymphatic system, and then ultimately the bloodstream. So they arrive at lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are basically like the kind of like the headquarters, I guess you could say. That's where all these tiny lymph vessels form and kind of merge into larger lymph vessels. And ultimately, they enter the circulatory system. And also tonsils, they're also lymph nodes. So as some people get their tonsils removed, this could be because like they're infected. So as I said, it's kind of in conjunction with the immune system. So if there's bacteria, they're going to get transported through the lymph system. And if they overwhelm the white blood cells, those lymph nodes can be infected. So basically, this kind of shows you, it's kind of interesting that like for the right side, it's not symmetrical. So for the right side, it's only kind of your upper right half. And then for the left side, it also includes the lower extremities. So basically, let's say you have like a bacteria over here. Basically, ultimately, when it goes through the lymphatic system, it's going to end up over here at the left subclavian vein, which both ultimately end up in the vena cava. And an edema is basically when the lymphatic system is overwhelmed. So it could be most likely an infection or bacterial infection or viral load, basically. And so that's when it's overloaded and it can't drain all of this fluid. So the fluid just begins to kind of accumulate, and that can push on the skin and create uncomfortable bumps or lumps. So next, I'll be talking about the immune system. So the most important thing to know about the immune system is it can be divided into kind of two sections or categories, the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. So the innate immune system, that's non-selective. That's what you want to think. So it targets pathogens, no matter what kind of pathogen, whatever, it just targets it. And it's usually the fast response within seconds or minutes, it's going to respond. And so this is composed of non-cellular barriers and then also cellular components. So non-cellular barriers, you can think of obvious things like skin is the most obvious, but then also you got to consider that you have holes in your body. So for example, your nose, it has hairs, it has mucus, and these things all act as barriers to kind of trap anything that might come in. Stomach acid is also a big thing because anything that goes through your mouth, most things are going to be killed by the stomach acid. And also kind of the microbacteria in your gut or the microbiome, that also kind of acts as an innate system, because basically the good bacteria in your gut, they kind of over-colonized that area, so no bad bacteria can kind of latch on. So that's another thing. And then the cellular component are white blood cells. So leukocytes, those are basically like macrophages or things that just non-selectively, just if they see something, they'll just engulf it if they feel like it's not part of the body. And then there's adaptive immunity, which is selective. So these are specific things like, let's say you have a certain cell that's going to target like the common cold virus or something like that. So usually this is a slower response because the body first needs to figure out what it's attacking before it can decide how it's going to attack that. And so basically this is just B and T cells, so I'll go over that a little bit later. The adaptive immunity system, it can be also divided into like active and passive within it, and then also like natural or artificial from there. So I haven't heard it come up too much, but basically, so like a passive system would be just you naturally get it. So it could be an artificial way, which is a vaccine. So you artificially get these antibodies that help boost your immune system. Or it could be the most common, and I can't think of another example, kind of like natural way to get passive immunity is like mother's breast milk that has natural antibodies that are passed into your bloodstream. And then so for active immunity, this is kind of just like natural. So basically, let's say you get an infection and your body suffers a little bit, but it naturally fights back. Or it could be like vaccination. So like, let's say you get vaccinated with a small, very harmless part of the virus or something like that, and then your body fights against it, and ultimately your body produces antibodies. So basically, white blood cells, also called leukocytes, there's a lot of them. This is something that you probably should know. So neutrophils, they're like the most abundant type. I kind of think of them as just like basically the rank and file soldiers. They phagocytosize bacteria. So that's basically just engulfing it and kind of disintegrating it with like enzymes and stuff like that. So yeah, they're like the first responders. Then monocytes, they're a little bit larger and they kind of go through great lengths to travel through the body. Again, using the lymphatic system to kind of circumnavigate the blood vessels. And ultimately, they differentiate into dendritic cells or macrophages. Macrophages, they're just basically huge, like massive neutrophils. So they basically can process a lot of pathogens. And then dendritic cells, basically, they're kind of the connection between, like we talked about, the adaptive and the innate immune system. So basically, they're right there. So basically, when something attacks you and your body doesn't know what it is, the dendritic cells help your adaptive immune system adapt to it. And this is done by presenting antigens, so I'll get into that a little bit later. And then there is eosinophils. So those are basically for parasitic infections. That's kind of the association, even though there's a little bit of overlap. Basophils, those are basically associated with allergic reactions. So what they do is they release histamine and heparin, and those kind of just create an immune system reaction. So in this case, it's kind of like it is an autoimmune disease of a sort, because your body is attacking something that, while it's not really yourself, it's just like peanut butter or something in theory that's harmless. And then mast cells, they're basically kind of a version of basophils, but they're basically found in mainly connective tissue and also mucous membranes. And so as you can see, like we've got like the macrophages and innate immunity, and these are the cellular version of innate immunity. And then we've got like B cells and T cells, that's over adaptive immunity. But as you can see, we kind of have like a bridge in between them. So we also have natural killer cells that are kind of a bridge in between them. So I'll be talking about that later. And then cytokines, they're basically the signaling proteins. That's basically all you need to know for the MCAT. They help coordinate the immune response. So they help various immune cells connect with each other, basically to say like, oh, there's an infection over here. So for example, macrophages, if they're going patrolling through the body and they start eating a bunch of bacteria, as they're doing that, they're also going to release a ton of cytokines. So basically other macrophages kind of can like sense their way, and then basically all of the other immune system cells can make sure they get to that area by following the trail of cytokines. Interleukin, that's a common type of cytokine. You'll see that in a lot of MCAT passages. Interferons, they're just basically another subset of cytokines, and they target viruses. So if a cell is infected by a virus, oftentimes it'll release these cytokines. So basically cells know that there's an infection going on in there if it's not basically taken over fast enough. So next, the adaptive immune system. We can divide this up into basically only two types of cells, so B cells and T cells. B cells, you want to think B cells, antibodies. T cells, I like to think of T Terminator, because they're basically kind of like the terminators of the immune system. They'll just go and like kill any bacteria or pathogens that are present. So the B cells, they create these antibodies, and this is also known as humoral immunity and humoral immunity. And so basically humor, you think blood, antibodies like floating around in the blood. And then the T cells, this is cell-mediated immunity, but it's cell-mediated immunity in the adaptive system. It's not cell-mediated immunity in the innate immune system. So it's make sure you know like what you're thinking about. And this is also known as cytotoxic immunity because they release a lot of toxic chemicals that kill the bacteria. And here we have a B cell. So B cells, all immune system cells for the adaptive immune system, so B cells and T cells, they all go through this very rigorous process of I like to think of it as kind of like training, like maybe they're like soldiers training for battle. So obviously if you have a soldier that doesn't know how to like fight well or doesn't know his task properly, you don't want him in the army because he's going to create problems. So but that's the same thing with B cells and T cells. They go through like a rigorous process basically to make sure they know that they're selecting the right target, because if they're not selecting the right target, that can create problems. So they're called naive, like naive, innocent, if they haven't been trained yet. So B cells and T cells, they're both produced in the bone liver. And when they're produced, they're naive cells. And then after they're produced, they move to lymphatic tissue. So lymph nodes. So for example, they might move to your tonsils. And this is where they prepare to encounter antigens. Antigens are basically anything that triggers an immune response. So it might be a part of a bacteria. It might be a specific protein that a virus produces. Probably not a virus. Very few viruses produce actual proteins, but it might be probably like a bacteria like LPS, just basically some sort of toxin that the immune system targets. And so once they're activated, so through this sort of training in the lymph nodes, once they're activated, they can either differentiate to be plasma cells, which their sole mission is just to secrete antibodies, or memory B cells. And so those basically, after you get an infection and you survive, you recover from it, your body is going to want to know how to fight this in the future. So basically it creates a memory. What was this antigen? How did it look like? So we know this antigen is this version of the common cold. So basically then when you encounter it next, your body instantly reactivates the memory B cells who can instantly react antigens and antigens to fight the antibodies. And this is how most vaccines work. Obviously with the COVID vaccine, it's a little different technology, but from a basic standpoint, the vaccines work because if you're exposed to an antigen twice, these memory B cells, they can act quicker to kind of fight this. So the vaccination, it kind of gives your body like a leg up in the fight. So we can see in this chart that after, and this would be, well, I guess if, for example, if it was just you're getting infected and you don't have a vaccine for it, initially you have a primary immune response. So you can see it's kind of low because the body doesn't know how to fight this bacteria. It's a new bacteria. But then the second time you can see that very quickly the body knows how to fight it because it's fought it before and it has all of the memory B cells to be prepared for it. Now T cells, they go through kind of the same elimination process as B cells. And this is important, especially for T cells, because if you have a T cell that, let's say, latches onto some sort of receptor, let's say in your bloodstream or basically anywhere, if it latches onto that and thinks that it's like a bacteria or a negative target, it's going to create a huge immune system, and your immune system is going to attack and destroy your own body. So these are autoimmune diseases. So basically, if one T cell kind of slips through the system and it's not a good T cell, it might just latch onto its target and create a memory. It might just create a cascade and destroy that area. Or it could just be like an overreactive hyperimmune system that's just running a little too rampant, even if you're not sick. It can increase your fever, so you might get a high body temperature. So those are not good. And like lupus or arthritis, multiple sclerosis, these are all autoimmune diseases that attack a specific target, and it results in different conditions that are just not good for your body. And then so there's, like the B cells, there's two basic types of T cells. There's helper T cells. So these kind of just communicate with the entire body. So through producing interleukins, things like that. They activate B cells. They kind of work with killer T cells. So as you saw, they kind of just like dendritic cells, they act as like a bridge between the innate and the adaptive immune systems. And then there's killer T cells. So these are like the terminator cells. These they're also called CD8 cells. Helper T cells are also called CD4 cells. And killer T cells are also called cytotoxic. Again, they're just toxic to bacteria and other things, as well as natural killer cells. So that's just kind of like a subcategory of killer cells. They all respond to major histopathology complex 1. So I'll talk about that a little later, but it's basically just kind of like a docking protein, you can think of it. So in this example, we have a phagocyte. So it's basically engulfed a virus, and it kind of strips apart the virus and kind of displays pieces of its like protein, certain proteins of the virus. And then basically, so this T helper cell, it locks onto that, and it kind of recognizes, okay, this is a bad protein. And then so the T helper cell somehow through some sort of cascade signals these natural killer cells that, hey, if you come in contact with this antigen, that this cell is infected. So basically, once it locks onto that, it realizes this cell is infected, and it'll probably release a bunch of enzymes and chemicals that ultimately kill this cell. So in this case, this is a human cell that's being killed, but it's infected by a virus, so it needs to just die, and they're gonna basically kind of like chomp up the bacteria, and not the bacteria, the human cell here, and just kind of dispose of it. So the major histopathology complex, there are these two types of docking proteins, and it gets very complicated. You just need to know 1 and 2 for the MCAT. So basically, so class 1, that's on all cells, basically anywhere in the human body. And basically, so it kind of like shows what's inside the cell to the outside. So if like there's a bunch of immune system cells kind of patrolling the area, basically they'll kind of like look around and see. You can kind of think about it as like a license plate. So they'll like look around and see, is something suspicious in this cell? If like the license plate numbers are messed up, they're gonna be like, wait, this isn't a normal human cell. This looks like viral proteins or things like that. So it's basically just monitoring these cells' health by T cells. And then class 2, these are special docking proteins that are found only in cells of the immune system, specifically antigen presenting cells. So these are cells like macrophages that they'll like, engulf a bacteria or virus and then display pieces of the virus's machinery on these histopathology complexes. So basically what's external, we're just presented outside the cell. And it's a little confusing. So like when you see CD8, you want to think class 1. And when you see CD4, you want to think class 2. They interact with each other. Basically, that's what you need to know, not exactly too much detail. Just know. Then the common mnemonic to think about is just like 8 times 1 is 8. 4 times 2 is 8. So 4 interacts with 2 and 8 interacts with 1. And then some just basic anatomy about the immune system. Bone marrow, it's the site of production of blood cells, or hemopoiesis. The spleen, you can think of like the blood's recycling center. It kind of breaks down decaying or old red blood cells or antibody tagged bacteria. Basically just kind of filters through the blood. And it also kind of acts like a lymph node, storing white blood cells. And then the thymus, that's basically, as you heard previously, the B cells and the T cells, they're all produced in the bone marrow, but they kind of go out to either the thymus or stay in the bone marrow for like differentiation. Basically, like you can think of their training. And then the lymphatic system, as I said, it kind of acts just as another transport system that cells can patrol through and kind of like slip in and out. You can think of like cops going in their cars kind of down the highway or maybe through side streets, just patrolling the area and make sure all cells are healthy and safe. And then so there's antibodies. It's important to know the structure of antibodies. So basically, you can think the stereotypical antibody is basically 4 protein strands, and they're connected by disulfide links. So these are very strong bonds. It's not just hydrogen bonds or something like that. And they can be divided into 4 different sections. So the red sections, that's the variable region. So each antibody is a little different. It has a very specific target it needs to go for. So, and this is due to hydrogen bonds and other things like that, chemical interactions. So, for example, if this antibody only targets the common cold, it's not gonna go for anything else. So the variable region is the thing that changes. That's the protein sequence that changes all the time. And then so there's the constant region. That's the black area, and that for that class of antibodies, that just stays the same. It's not going to change. So yeah. And then there's the heavy chain and the light chain. So the light chain is the smaller part. The heavy chain is the larger part. So both the heavy and light chain include parts that are variable and also constant. And then the epitope, that's like the region on the antigen that's recognized. So you can see in this diagram that like you can think of it as kind of like a puzzle piece. So that's the piece of whatever it is, the virus or a piece of protein that's a toxin. That's the piece that locks into the paratope, which I've never seen before, but that's basically the interconnecting part of that's the interconnecting part of the antibody. But basically, it's important to know what the antigen and antibody are. And basically, if you don't remember anything, remember that they're highly specific. So this is all about the adaptive immune system. This is highly specific for something. And basically, just a last overview. What's going to happen in like your stereotypical infection? Basically, there's this microbe, and then the macrophage, which is it's the cell part of the innate immune system. It's going to say, hey, this looks a little funny. Like, it's not going to know exactly what it is, but it's going to be like, okay, I've monitored it. It doesn't look that good, so let me engulf it. It's going to digest it and basically put pieces of this microbe's machinery outside. And then so the helper T cell, which is the bridge between adaptive and innate and adaptive, basically it's going to see this and be like, okay, I know this is the piece I want to look out for. And basically through all these cascades and signalings with interleukins, it's going to basically tell these cytotoxic T cells, okay, here's what you need to look out for. Here's what you need to target. And it's going to also tell the B cells, the memory B cell just going to be like, okay, keep in memory that whenever we see this, we attack it. And it's going to tell the B cells that produce antibodies, okay, produce a ton of antibodies right now because we're infected and we need to fight whatever this infection is. And then so it's a very complex system, so I can't really go through everything. It would take forever. But if you do feel, and all the topics I've covered, they're very high yield, you're probably going to come across them. But if you want to just learn a little bit more, you could also learn about like the lineage of the cells. So if you get a really insane question, they might be like, oh, like, do red blood cells come from a lymphoid stem cell or a myeloid stem cell? So basically, it's almost like a family lineage where they come from. And then also there's 5 different types of antibodies, and they each kind of have their own function. I never came across this ever in my studying, but I saw in a couple of the packets that they mentioned it, so I figured I'd put it out there. So there's different types there. And then the complement system, that's basically just elaborating on what I've said before, how basically they're like puzzle pieces, how they interlock with each other and basically trigger some sort of effect. So yeah, so sorry if I rushed through that. I know it's a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to either put it in the chat or mention anything. That way. Yeah. If Karen, if you want to put it in the chat, just the link. So this is going to be our passage practice. It's on the immune system. It's on Khan Academy. So are you guys willing to, if you guys are still there, do you want to take 10 minutes and go over this? Yeah, so I guess I'll give you guys, do you think that's good if I give them, let's say 8 minutes? And if you want to go through the questions, they're not very difficult. The passage is kind of there just to help you, but after that, we can go over the questions. Did that give you enough time, Jennifer, or do you still have a couple more questions you're working on? Okay, so in case you had any trouble with any of the questions or just for the recording, I'll kind of just go over the Khan Academy questions. So the first question is basically talking about TRCs. This isn't something you'd be expected to know, and it's basically asking which of the, if you have misfolded TRCs, basically what would you not expect to happen? So basically, for this question, it is like a little tricky, but basically what they want you to know is that the difference between the innate and the adaptive immune system. So in the passage, when they mention the toll-like receptors, they say it plays a large role in innate immunity. So basically, if you have a misfolded one, you would not expect the innate immune system to not be activated. So basically, it's a little confusing with the contractions and like double negatives, but as long as you follow the pathway about what affects what, it kind of explains itself. And then so for the next question, vaccines are similar to which type of immunity? Basically, this is pretty simple. You can tell that the innate immunity, that's just non-specific, but vaccines are very specific. You get a vaccine for very specific diseases or very specific viruses. So you know that that has to be relating to the adaptive immune system. Next, what's true about the adaptive but not the innate immune system? So basically, both of them, they both fight basically whatever enters in your body. Pathogens, they've evolved to fight both of them. For example, some pathogens have evolved to like be able to stick onto mucus-lined membranes so that they don't drip away. So both have been evolved against it. And also with both of them, there's a very complex coordination between cells, between bridge cells. So that just leaves us with choice D. And you should just know that for the adaptive immune system, it's very specific to one sort of bacteria or pathogen. And then so they're asking about which of the following would activate these toll-like receptors. So again, in the passage, this kind of boils down to that small sentence where they mentioned that it has a strong role in the innate immune system. So this is a little tricky. It stumped me at first because I was thinking like, oh, it could be gram-positive bacteria, or it could be this hepatitis B surface antigen. But ultimately, they want you to make that association again with the innate immune system. And so when we're talking about these specific antigens, that's talking about antibodies, T cells, B cells. That's all about the adaptive immune system, not the innate immune system. And then so they're talking about inflation. Inflation usually occurs whenever there's kind of like a fight going on between the immune system and whatever pathogen is attacking it. So they're basically saying, which cells do you expect to be the most numerous in a new inflation? So the key word here is a new inflation, inflammation, something that's just happened. And so this goes back to what I said. It couldn't be B cells because that's adaptive, and that takes over a course of time, like hours or days. It wouldn't really be like common myeloid. It wouldn't really be that because they're not really prepared for battle, you could say. It might be neutrophils, and the natural killer cells, again, that's adaptive immune system. So just by knowing adaptive and innate immune system, you can answer this question. And then also you should know that neutrophils, they're basically the frontline soldiers. They're the first that get called into battle. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to email us, or Jennifer, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat or just use your audio. But thanks so much for everything, and hope to see you guys soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Should I stop the recording?
Sure.